Assalamu alaikum students. I hope you are doing well and studying social psychology. Today we are starting a new section of our syllabus and that is evaluating persons and relationships. पिछले लेक्चर में हमने एक पूरा सेक्शन खत्म कर लिया था and that was thinking about self and others. आपको याद होगा कि जब हमने अपने सिलेबस का पहला सेक्शन खत्म किया था and that was overview of social psychology, तो हमने उसका पूरा रिव्यू किया था. So today I would also like to review the previous section that is thinking about self and others और उसके बाद फिर हम नया सेक्शन शुरू करेंगे. इस सेक्शन में हमने 4 चैप्टर्स पढ़े थे जो कि डिवाइडेड थे डिफरेंट लेक्चर्स में. अब ये 4 चैप्टर्स कौन कौन से थे आपको याद होगा. द फर्स्ट वन वाज द सेल्फ एंड द सेकंड वाज पर्सन परसेप्शन और पर्सन परसेप्शन ही का एक पार्ट था एट्रीब्यूशन. आप इसको पर्सन परसेप्शन में भी इंक्लूड कर सकते हैं एंड यू कैन डील विद दैट सेपरेटली आल्सो. द फोर्थ सेक्शन ऑफ दैट पर्टिकुलर पार्ट ऑफ आवर सिलेबस वाज सोशल कॉग्निशन जिसका इख्तिताम पिछले लेक्चर में हुआ. तो अब ये सारे जो चैप्टर्स हमने अब तक पढ़े हैं इनको रिव्यू करते हैं. द फर्स्ट चैप्टर एज आई टोल्ड यू बिफोर वाज द सेल्फ एंड वी हैड डिस्कस्ड दैट द सेल्फ वाज रेफरेंस्ड इन मोर देन 9,000 articles, whether they were written in books or research articles in psychological abstracts. और psychological abstracts के बारे में मैंने आपको बताया था कि psychology का database होता है जिसमें से books से और research articles से references शामिल किए जाते हैं. So, the self was researched so much in 1999 and it was 6 times greater than it was mentioned in 1970s. So, इससे आपको अंदाजा होता है कि इस टॉपिक की कितनी अहमियत है. So, what we discussed in that particular chapter of the self, we talked about self as the target of attention and active agent. When we say self is an active agent, then we are talking about I part of self. I is the active agent, organizer, initiator. And when we talk about me part of self, then we are talking about target of attention. And when we are in the state of I part of self, then we are the subject of consciousness. And when we are in the state of me, then we are the object of consciousness. We also talked about public and private awareness. Actually, self-concept जब develop होता है तो we may be privately self-conscious or may be public self-conscious. और हमने इन दोनों के pros and cons भी देखे थे कि if the person is privately self-conscious and if the person is publicly self-conscious, so what happens? Studies have shown that if a person is privately self-conscious, so he is more adjusted to the world. Kyunke the person is very conscious that what will be the reaction of people toward him or her. That is why he is more adjusted. He tries to accommodate and adjust as other people are behaving to him. And on the other hand, if a person is privately self-conscious, then there are other benefits also. For example, the person is very aware of what is going on in himself or herself. और उसका नतीजा ये होता है कि if, for example, we are having some psychological or physical problem, we are conscious about that and we can take precautionary measures. लेकिन इसका एक नुकसान ये होता है if the person is very much self-aware, तो then he spends a lot of time in looking deeply in himself or herself. और जब एक शख्स जो है वो बहुत ज़्यादा aware होता है what is going on in me, for example, inside what is happening deep inside me, then sometime we have exaggeration of effect. और exaggeration of effect जब मैं कहती हूँ तो effect से मुराद ये है कि my current state of mind, my current mood. तो exaggeration जो है वो 2 तरह से होती है. For example, the positive aspect of this is that I could be very happy on some happy news. On the other hand, the negative aspect of that is that I could be depressed, I could be dejected if I am hearing a bad news. So if a person is privately self-conscious, then the person could indulge in negative emotions और negative talk, self-talk भी इसमें हो सकती है. इसीलिए ये कहा जाता है, this is actually one form of therapy, that if you are very privately self-conscious and you are very aware of what is happening inside of you, and you are very depressed, then you should indulge in that. So you should distract your self-awareness by indulging in other activities. और हम इसीलिए कहते हैं अगर कोई शख्स डिप्रेस्ड होता है कि you should walk, you should do exercise, or you should watch TV, for example, read books. तो ये डिपेंड करता है कि what is the orientation and hobby of that particular person. इसी तरह से हमने प्राइवेट और पब्लिक सेल्फ कॉन्शियसनेस की बात करने के बाद we talked about when self-awareness is developed. The studies have shown that self-awareness is not innate and it is also not found in infancy. For example, different research articles have shown that if you show mirror image to a child and the child could be from 9 to 12 months, तो बच्चा ये पहचान नहीं पाता कि जो शीशे में तस्वीर है वो उसकी अपनी है. It is very important that oneself, a person identifies internal self before he recognizes his or her image in the mirror. अपना बाहर का इमेज देखने से पहले आपको internal identity develop होनी जरूरी होती है. So studies have also shown that self-awareness develops around 18 months. और उसकी वजह ये भी हो सकती है कि one particular part of brain which has been found associated with self-awareness develops around 18 months. And what was that part? आपको शायद याद होगा, I had mentioned that anterior cingulate of frontal lobe. ये frontal lobe कुछ यहाँ पर located होती है, and frontal lobe is a part of cerebral cortex, which is the outer part of brain tissue. Cerebral cortex का जो part है frontal lobe, which is on the front of our head, anterior cingulate उसका एक part है, and anterior cingulate has been found through research associated with self-awareness. That particular part of brain is involved in focused problem solving and attention also. So studies have shown that around 18 months anterior cingulate and its spindle cells develop. And because of that, a person may become self-aware around that particular age. और उसके बाद हम ये देखते हैं कि self-concept और self-awareness is very complex and very much developed and become a very integrated part of a person during adolescent. इसीलिए इसको स्टैनले हॉल ने कहा है कि adolescent is the time of stress and storm because adolescents are really very concerned about their identity and they are very much self-aware. And then we talked about self-regulation. Self-regulation से मुराद ये है कि when we are able to control ourselves, when we are regulating ourselves, and the person is the I state of self when the person is self-regulating. In self-regulating, we mean that we forego the immediate gratification for the sake of future benefits, greater future benefits, and we control ourselves and we think that if we forego the current that perhaps that is related with future benefits. And then we also talked about many positive aspects of self-regulation और उसमें आपने ये देखा होगा कि हमने अप्लाइड सोशल साइकोलॉजी लैब के तहत कुछ रिसर्चेस का भी जायजा लिया था और उसके अलावा मैंने आपको एक काम ये भी दिया था कि आप जर्नल में इसके बारे में लिखें कि how you can self-regulate yourself. Then we also talked about impact of culture and family on the growth of self-awareness, on the growth of a person. जब हम ये बात करते हैं कि फैमिली की इन्वॉल्वमेंट है सेल्फ अवेयरनेस में और जो हमारे सेल्फ स्कीमास डेवलप होते हैं उनमें फैमिली की इन्वॉल्वमेंट है, तो वी कैन नॉट सेपरेट फैमिली फ्रॉम द कल्चर, क्योंकि जो भी फैमिली होगी दैट विल बी in the context of a particular culture. Then we also talked about the impact of culture regarding individualistic and collectivistic cultures. And we found out that people who are living in collectivistic cultures and people who are living in individualistic cultures, they develop different kinds of schemas. When we say that they develop different kinds of schemas, it doesn't mean that all of their self-concepts and self-schemas are totally different from each other. It does mean that they would have some differences. For example, research has shown that people who are living in collectivistic cultures, they are more conformist, they are more dependent on their significant others, their relationships, and they know their place in a particular group. As compared to that, people who live in individualistic cultures, they are rather independent. They give more importance to their personal freedom and their personal success. तो ये सारे जो स्कीमाज हैं जो हमारी सेल्फ में डेवलप होते हैं, दे आर डेवलप्ड बिकॉज वी आर ब्रॉट अप इन अ पर्टिकुलर फैमिली एंड इन अ पर्टिकुलर कल्चर. एंड एट द सेम टाइम इट इज आल्सो ट्रू दैट देयर आर डिफरेंट कल्चर्स विद इन वन कल्चर. और ये कौन से होते हैं? फॉर एग्जाम्पल, इफ यू से that one culture on the broader level is a collectivistic culture and the other culture on the broadest level is individualistic cultures, then in collectivistic cultures there could be several subgroups and they could be based on the educational grounds and then they could be based on other factors. For example, if a person is living in a rural area or urban area, so your self concept and your self schemas will be developed accordingly. Then we talked about self-esteem, which is the evaluative part of yourself. Your self-esteem could be high, your self-esteem could be low, and it is referring to the worth of oneself, what we conceive, what we perceive about ourselves. And we talked about the role of family in increasing a person's self-esteem or decreasing one's self-esteem. And when we said that the role of family is important, then we talked about three kinds of parents in this particular issue. And three kinds of parents कौन-कौन से थे? Authoritarian parents, authoritative parents and submissive parents. और आपको याद होगा कि मैंने ये कहा था कि रिसर्च ये शो करती है कि children of authoritarian and submissive parents are low in self-esteem. और आपको इनकी डेफिनेशंस याद होंगी. थोड़ा सा मैं आपके लिए रिवाइज कर देती हूँ. अथॉरिटेरियन पेरेंट्स वो होते हैं which have strict rules and principles defined for their children, but they do not want the say of children in those particular issues. As compared to that, submissive parents are those parents who just submit to whatever children want to do. और तीसरे जो किस्म के पेरेंट्स हैं वो हैं अथॉरिटेटिव पेरेंट्स. अथॉरिटेटिव पेरेंट्स आर similar to authoritarian parents in that sense that they have very clearly defined set rules and principles कि ये इस तरह से बच्चों को जिंदगी गुजारनी चाहिए. But they are different from authoritative parents in that sense that they clearly define that what is the reason for these, what is the basis and rationale of these rules, and they listen to their children at the same time. So self-esteem, according to research of children of authoritative parents, is usually high. So this was the first chapter of that particular section, and that chapter was the self. The second chapter of that particular section was person perception. Person perception is actually the process by which we come to know about the person's temporary desires, emotions, as well as his permanent personality traits. And it has two aspects. One is impression formation and the other is attribution. इसीलिए मैंने आपको कहा था कि एट्रीब्यूशन को हम पर्सन परसेप्शन का पार्ट भी समझ सकते हैं. अब सबसे पहले इम्प्रेशन फॉर्मेशन की बात करते हैं. हाउ डू वी फॉर्म द इम्प्रेशन ऑफ अदर पर्सन व्हेन वी आर परसीविंग दैट पर्टिकुलर पर्सन, मेल और फीमेल? द इम्प्रेशन फॉर्मेशन इज लार्जली डिटर्मिन्ड बाय नॉन वर्बल एज वेल एज वर्बल कम्युनिकेशंस. हम किसी शख्स के बारे में जब अंदाजा लगाते हैं तो सिर्फ वर्बल कम्युनिकेशन की अहमियत नहीं है, बल्कि नॉन वर्बल कम्युनिकेशन आल्सो प्लेज अ सिग्निफिकेंट रोल इन परसीविंग अदर पीपल. नॉन वर्बल कम्युनिकेशन की अहमियत का एहसास आपको उस वक्त बहुत ज्यादा हो जाता है व्हेन द पर्टिकुलर पर्सन विद हुम यू आर इंटरैक्टिंग डजंट नो योर लैंग्वेज. मैं आपके साथ अपना एक एक्सपीरियंस शेयर करना चाहूंगी. व्हेन आई वेंट टू वंस टू फ्रांस and the other time to Morocco, people over there didn't know English. Especially in France, people know English, but they are not ready to even speak a single word of that particular language. And we had to rely most of the time on non-verbal communication. And then I understood the importance of non-verbal communication. कि आप किसी शख्स के फ्रेंडली होने का अंदाज़ा, किसी शख्स के रूड होने का अंदाज़ा भी non-verbal communication से लगाते हैं. For example, the person could be perceived as if very friendly if the person is smiling, और could be considered very rude अगर वो आप कोई सवाल पूछते हैं और वो आपकी तरफ देखता है और मुंह फेर के चला जाता है. So non-verbal communication is really very important when you are forming the impression of a person. And then we also talked about other aspects of impression formation. One of them was implicit personality theory. Implicit personality theory का मतलब ये है कि when we have an idea about a person, कि that particular person has a particular trait, तो usually we have a tendency कि one particular trait could be directing to the similar kind of traits. For example, cardinal traits are very important in forming the impression of a person. और ऐश की स्टडीज आपको याद होंगी जिनका हमने जिक्र किया था कि warmth and cold, अगर a person is perceived as warm or cold, then that person will be evaluated in the same direction. People who are perceived as very warm, they are also attributed to have very positive traits. इसके बरक्स अगर आप एक शख्स को परसीव करते हैं कि दैट पर्सन इज कोल्ड, so you usually associate other negative traits with that person. So implicit personality theory mean that traits go together. If a person is having one particular positive trait, then that person should have other positive traits as well, although it is not essential that if a person is warm, he definitely should be brave, courageous and so on. इसके अलावा हमने कुछ और एस्पेक्ट्स का भी जिक्र किया था. As far as person perception and impression formation is concerned, one of them was halo effect, that a liked person is perceived positively. अगर आप किसी शख्स को एक अच्छा शख्स समझ लेते हैं पहली दफा, तो आप उसके मुताबिक आप सोचते हैं कि उसमें बाकी भी अच्छे ट्रेट्स होंगे. So this is usually problematic in person perception, because this is not essential that a liked person will always behave in a positive direction, in a positive way. Then we also talked about primacy and recency effects. Primacy is the first impression of a person, and you are likely to keep that impression with you while you are interpreting the personality of that person. And we then talked about recency effects, that the last bit of information about a particular person could leave an impression on you. लेकिन अगर इन दोनों का comparison करें तो primacy effect has more power in that. And then we talked about some challenges that we come across when we are perceiving other people, and these challenges are when you are interacting with attractive and particularly baby-faced people, because it could lead to erroneous conclusions. And then another problem in person perception is that whether we can detect lies or not. As far as baby faces are concerned, इस सिलसिले में हमने बहुत सारी researches का भी जिक्र किया था, and we talked about advantages and disadvantages of perceiving people as baby faced. And we also talked that if you perceived someone as having a baby face, then you attribute certain traits with the personality of a person. For example, baby faced people are perceived as honest and trustworthy and dependent, but at the same time they are considered less competent. और इससे बहुत सारी प्रॉब्लम्स उन लोगों को हो जाती है. People who are having baby face, for example, research has shown that they will be considered less competent if they apply for some job. और एडवर्टीजमेंट में और जॉब्स में ये देखा गया है कि people have discrimination against them. तो ऐसी जॉब्स जिसमें competence is required and expertise is required, they are usually ranked low, and they are less likely to get these kind of jobs. और इसी तरह हमने ये देखा था कि जस्टिस में भी when we are talking about any crimes, then they have a problem as in judicial system as well, in that sense that there could be double standards of justice. Double standards किस तरह से कि ये समझा जाता है, और जब हम ये कहते हैं ये समझा जाता है तो इससे मुराद ये है कि बहुत सारी researches have proved that कि अगर baby faced people have committed some offense, या उन पर कोई जो है वो जुर्म साबित नहीं हुआ और लगाया जा रहा है, तो यूजुअली ये समझा जाता है कि वो they could be able to conduct those kind of offenses which are due to negligence. कि नेग्लिजेंट वो हो सकते हैं बट दे यूजुअली वुडंट डू इंटेंशनली एनी हार्म टू अदर पर्सन. तो ये भी कोई ज़रूरी नहीं है कि बेबी फेस्ड पीपल विल नॉट बी नेग्लिजेंट मोर एंड दे कुड नॉट बी डूइंग एनी हार्म टू अदर पीपल. अगला जो इसी का एक चैलेंज था जो मैंने अभी आपके साथ शेयर किया, दैट वाज डिटेक्टिंग लाइज. एंड वी हैव सीन दैट व्हेन डिटेक्शन ऑफ लाइज इज कंसर्न्ड, देन facial expressions are not that much accurate as your physical gestures. यानी आपका body जो है that could express when you are lying. और इसके अलावा हमने verbal और non-verbal communication का इसमें जिक्र किया था कि how could you detect lies when people are interacting with you. लेकिन ये एक बहुत बड़े आर्ट की बात है, because sometime तो हम समझते हैं कि हमने एक शख्स की लाई को डिटेक्ट कर लिया है, बट दे मे नॉट बी एक्यूरेट. और हमने बहुत सारी मिसालें भी दी थी कि जो ज़्यादातर लोग जिन क्यूज़ पर कंसंट्रेट करते हैं, समटाइम दे आर नॉट एक्यूरेट. एंड फॉर डिटेक्टिंग लाइज देयर आर पर्टिकुलर verbal and non-verbal cues which should be considered. Then the next section of person perception was attribution. Attribution is not just impression formation, it is actually going beyond that. On the basis of past experience with a person and at the basis of past behavior of a person, you predict the future behavior of that person. And then you have some idea what could be the cause of that particular person's behavior. और attribution के जिक्र जब हमने किया तो we talked about internal, stable and controllable explanations. और इसी तरह इनके opposites भी देख लें. When we are talking about internal attribution, at the same time we could say that the attribution could be due to external factors. इसी तरह opposite of stable is unstable and opposite of controllable is uncontrollable. Locus of causality की बात की थी हीडर ने, and he said that when we are attributing the causes of people's behavior, then sometime we use internal attribution and sometime we are talking about external attribution. इसके बरक्स वीनर ने बात की थी controllability और stability की. And we took several examples of people's behavior when we are explaining any person's action, then we could say that that person is himself responsible for that, then that cause is internal. जब हमारे साथ कोई बुरा सलूक करता है तो हम कहते हैं that person is actually rude, so that explanation is internal. And when we say that that person would have some problem on that particular day when that person was interacting with me, that is why he was rude, then we are using external attribution. And when we say that that person always behaves in a rude manner, then we are talking about stability of that person's behavior and stability of attribution. So we talked about internal, stable and controllable factors in attributing a person's behavior. And then we talked about different errors that could happen in attributing the causation. And that errors could be fundamental attribution error. Then we talked about actor-observer bias, false consensus effect and self-serving attribution bias. थोड़ा सा इनका दोबारा जिक्र कर लेते हैं. What is fundamental attribution error? In fundamental attribution error, we usually attribute internal causes to other person's behavior. That person was rude, that is why he behaved like that. That person is very dull, that person is low in intelligence, that person doesn't have competence, that is why he couldn't succeed in that particular examination. That could be internal attribution. Or usually when we explain other people's behavior, we are having this kind of bias. Or this is different when we are explaining our behavior. Or that could be explained through actor-observer bias. When we are saying actor-observer bias, it means then when we are talking about our behavior, then usually we explain the causes of our behavior as external. That I could not succeed that exam because the teacher was against me, because the paper was difficult, because the weather was not good in that particular day, because I was having flu. So usually when we are perceiving ourselves, we are perceiving ourselves as actors. And when we are observing other people, it is observing other people. और उससे मुराद ये है कि हम internal attribution use करते हैं when we are talking about the behavior of other people. Then we talked about false consensus effect. We think that our behavior is typical and whatever our attitudes and beliefs are, most of the people will be thinking on the same lines. So it means that our behavior our beliefs and attitudes are most commonly found in population, and sometimes we are having erroneous conclusion about that particular aspect. Then we talked about self-serving attribution bias. When we say self-serving attribution bias, it could also become a positive connotation or a negative connotation. Self-serving attribution bias से मुराद ये है कि we usually attribute our successes to our internal positive traits and our failures to external factors. अब इसका positive aspect ये है कि it usually saves us from depression or from low mood, क्योंकि हम ये समझते हैं कि our failures could be to external factors और उससे हमारे पे ज़्यादा असर नहीं होता. We do not get depressed. इसके बरक्स अगर कोई कामयाबी नसीब होती है तो हम समझते हैं because I had that much competence, I had that particular positive traits, that is why I was successful. तो इसका फ़ायदा भी थेरेपी में है और बाज़ औक़ात इसको आप सिखाते हैं पेशेंट को इस तरह से बिहेव करना या क्लाइंट को so that that person could be saved from anxiety and depression. And the last section or the last topic of that particular section that was thinking about self and others was social cognition, how you perceive your social world. We understand world usually by categorization. We make our world coherent and organized by categorizing people. और जब categorization की बात होती है तो categorization of objects भी हो सकती है and categorization of people in social psychology particularly. When we categorize objects तो हम उनके पर्टिकुलर करेक्टरिस्टिक्स जो वो शेयर करती हैं उसकी बेस पर हम कैटेगराइज कर लेते हैं. फॉर एग्जांपल, व्हाट कुड बी द करेक्टरिस्टिक ऑफ एन ऑटोमोबाइल, व्हाट कुड बी द करेक्टरिस्टिक ऑफ अ कप, तो उसकी बेसिस पे हम कैटेगराइजेशन करते हैं. एज फार एज पीपल आर कंसर्न्ड, यूजुअली दे आर कैटेगराइज्ड ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ पर्टिकुलर करेक्टरिस्टिक्स. फॉर एग्जांपल, ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ एजुकेशन, ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ एथनिक ग्रुप्स, ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ देयर जेंडर, और कई और तरह की कैटेगरीज की बेसिस हो सकती हैं. एंड कैटेगराइजेशन इज यूजुअली डन ऑन द बेसिस ऑफ प्रोटोटाइप्स. प्रोटोटाइप इज द पर्टिकुलर रिप्रेजेंटेटिव कैरेक्टरिस्टिक ऑफ दैट पर्टिकुलर ग्रुप. और ये जरूरी है कि वो शख्स जो उस कैटेगरी में शामिल है दैट शुड शेयर विद दैट प्रोटोटिपिकल कैरेक्टरिस्टिक. एंड देन वी टॉक्ड अबाउट स्कीमास. स्कीमास एक्चुअली थ्योरीज अबाउट डिफरेंट थिंग्स, ऑब्जेक्ट्स. And social cognition is having these two elements. We make categorization of people according to different characteristics, and then we develop certain schemas so that we could explain our social world. And then we talk about different rules of thumbs, जिनको cognitive misers भी कहते हैं, और हम जल्दी से किसी नतीजे पर पहुंचने के लिए और चीज़ों को explain करने के लिए we use these cognitive shortcuts. और ये cognitive shortcuts का जब हमने जिक्र किया तो we particularly talked about two kinds of heuristics or shortcuts which were representativeness heuristic and availability heuristic. Representativeness heuristic से मुराद ये है कि a person should represent a particular group or class which he is representing, और represent कैसे करेगा उसकी characteristics को share करके. And when we are talking about availability heuristic, then we are talking about the probability or frequency of that particular object, कि कितनी आसानी से वो हमारे जहन में उसका तस्वर आ जाता है. So that is referring to availability heuristic. And then apart from these heuristics, we talked about other aspects of social cognition, and sometimes we explain things on the basis of our previous experiences, our past events. So sometimes our social judgment is based on the recollection of past events as well as on the expectation of the person who is perceiving his social world. As far as recollection of past events is concerned, we talked about counterfactual thinking and hindsight bias. ये जो अब मैं डिस्कस कर रही हूँ ये हमने पिछले लेक्चर में डिस्कस किया था. Recollection of past events and expectations. जैसा कि मैंने अभी कहा कि रिकलेक्शन ऑफ पास्ट इवेंट्स इज कंसर्न, तो उसमें हमने काउंटर फैक्चुअल थिंकिंग और हाइंडसाइट बायस का जिक्र किया. हाइंडसाइट बायस आपको याद होगा कि हमने अपने लेक्चर 2 में डिस्कस किया था कि पीपल हैव डिफरेंट मिसकॉन्सेप्शंस अबाउट सोशल साइकोलॉजी. और hindsight bias है क्या? It is actually our tendency to overestimate our ability about the outcome of some event when these events actually have happened. तो जब हमें उसके रिजल्ट का पता चल जाता है तो हमें लगता है कि हाँ, हम भी यही समझ रहे थे कि यही नतीजा आएगा. But it only happens when we know the result or outcome of some event. And then we talked about counterfactual thinking. Counterfactual thinking is actually what-if thinking. We are talking about the alternative explanations. And these alternative explanations are usually about negative events. आज मेरा किसी मोटरसाइकिल के साथ एक्सीडेंट हो गया और अगर मैं आज मोटरसाइकिल पे ना आता तो फिर क्या होता. सो अल्टरनेटिव एक्सप्लेनेशंस के बारे में हम सोचते हैं. Research has shown that if we indulge too much in counterfactual thinking, that it could lead to negative affect, negative mood. और इसमें ये देखा गया था कि बहुत सारी रिसर्चेस ने ये शो किया कि अगर उन्होंने इंटरव्यू किया कुछ पेरेंट्स का who had lost their children and who had spouses who had lost their spouse. So they found out that people who were indulged in counterfactual thinking, alternative explanation कि अगर ये ना होता तो for example ये लोग आज जिंदा होते, तो those people were really finding it difficult to cope with their life. And these people were more depressed than those people who were not having counterfactual thinking. Then we also talked about social cognition as a result of our expectations. And what were those expectations? For example, one of them was self-fulfilling prophecy. Self-fulfilling prophecy से मुराद ये है कि when we behave differently towards some person and we show some particular kind of attitude toward that particular person, so that person actually starts behaving in the same direction as we are showing our attitude toward that particular person. So, इसमें कंसिस्टेंसी हमारे एटीट्यूड में और दूसरे शख्स के बिहेवियर में कंसिस्टेंसी कायम हो जाती है. फॉर एग्जांपल, इफ वी आर टेलिंग अदर पर्सन दैट ही इज इनकॉम्पिटेंट, तो अल्टीमेटली दैट पर्सन मे बिहेव इन अ इनकॉम्पिटेंट वे. इसीलिए कहा जाता है कि आप कोशिश करें कि व्हेन यू आर डीलिंग विद अदर पीपल देन यू टेक केयर कि आप उसकी तरफ किस तरह का रिस्पॉन्स शो कर रहे हैं, बिकॉज दैट पर्सन could be behaving actually in that incompetent way. और इसको positive direction में भी आप ले सकते हैं. If you are behaving toward children that, for example, they are doing well in their exams, they are competent in one particular subject, so maybe they will be having outstanding or good performance in that particular area. And then we also talked about learned helplessness and belief in just word. Learned helplessness क्या है कि when a person is encountered with repeated failures, then that person starts expecting failure in future. और उसका नतीजा क्या होता है कि that person starts struggling for any new kind of thing. For example, अगर job के लिए apply करना है, तो that person has learned to become helpless. That is why he may not try in future for that particular job. And then we talked about belief in just word. Belief in just world mean that you believe that good things are happening to good people, and if bad things happen to bad people, then they deserve that. So world is actually as a very fair place. अब ये सारे जो concepts हैं जो हमने different chapters में discuss किए, और different chapters कौन से हैं? The self, person perception and social cognition. We also talked about the practical implications of all these chapters. अब थोड़े से concepts का मैं जिक्र करूंगी क्योंकि हमने अभी अगला जो सेक्शन है वो भी शुरू करना है. Particularly, I would like to mention a few concepts which are related with all of these chapters. One concept is self-regulation. And I had stressed when I was teaching and talking about self-regulation कि आपको अपनी ज़िंदगी में इसको implement करना चाहिए. You should self-regulate on those activities which you think are not doing good to you. For example, कई दफ़ा ये होता है कि we are not studying because we don't feel like studying. Exam करीब है but you want to sleep more, you want to go to parties, and similarly those people who are having more weight than they should have according to their height and age, then they are eating too much. तो इस सिलसिले में भी सेल्फ रेगुलेशन पे जो स्टडीज हुई हैं, दे हैव प्रूव्ड दैट पीपल कैन रिड्यूस देयर वेट एक्चुअली बाय सेल्फ रेगुलेटिंग. सो वी कैन इन फैक्ट गेट रिड ऑफ मैनी bad habits like smoking, a lot of too much eating, and other kind of habitual things which are not good for us. We can get rid of them by self-regulating. And then, as I talked about the positive aspect of self-serving attribution bias, कि इसको भी अपने positive direction में ले सकते हैं, because if you are thinking that the bad things are happening due to external factors and good things are happening because of your personal traits, the success is because you are doing a lot of hard work, the success is because you are very intelligent, तो फिर इससे आपकी self esteem को boost मिलता है, and maybe this could be good for your performance. Then I also talked about the practical implication of self-serving, self-fulfilling prophecy, कि जब आप दूसरों के साथ behave करें तो don't treat them as if they are incompetent, they are not worthy of doing something good or performing good. तो इस सिलसिले में हमें एहतियात बरतनी चाहिए. And then we are also, in the previous lecture we discussed about learned helplessness, that we should be having those kind of attribution which could help us in performing in a better way. And that is why I talked in the previous lecture that people should avoid stable, internal and global explanations of things. Global explanation तब होती है जब हम ये कहते हैं कि तमाम चीज़ें जो हैं वो उनमें मुझे for example failure ही मिलेगी. Wherever I go, I will find failure. And stable explanation is that if I am failure on one aspect, I will be failure on other aspects also. For example, if I'm not good in maths, I am not good in anything else. And then internal explanation is that if I have failed math, it is because I am unable to learn math. तो इससे फिर learned helplessness पैदा होती है. So these are a few dimensions on which I would like you to concentrate and make them useful in your personal life. और जहाँ भी जिसका फ़ायदा आपको मिल सकता है, I would advise that you should those principles of social psychology for the benefit in your personal life. So this was the review of previous section that was thinking about self and others. Now I start the next section of our syllabus. अब next section जो अब मैं शुरू करने जा रही हूँ, that is evaluating persons and relationships. It is not essential that we always like to perceive our social world and we like to perceive what is happening around us, but we like also to evaluate them. And when we are saying evaluating, it means that we are either liking something or disliking something. अब ये जो section है evaluating person and relationship, it has particular chapters also. One chapter is attitude formation and attitude change. And the second one could be prejudice and discrimination. When we are saying prejudice and discrimination, then usually we are talking about groups, other groups. And in that section, in that particular part of that particular section, we will be talking about intergroup intolerance, why people are intolerant about other groups, and what are the causes of this racial or ethnic discriminations, and how people cope with stigmatization, and so on. And then we will also talk about interpersonal attractions. Interpersonal attraction is a positive kind of evaluation, and usually it is for one person. So as compared to prejudice and discrimination is usually for groups, while interpersonal attraction is usually between one and another person. So it is person to person. आज हम इस सिलसिले का पहला चैप्टर शुरू करते हैं, and that is attitudes. और attitudes के आज हम components देखेंगे, and we will also talk about how to assess and measure attitudes. So the first question is, what is an attitude? In 1995, Schumann said that attitude is a positive or negative evaluation of an object. जब मैंने object कहा है, तो इससे मुराद कोई शख्स भी हो सकता है. It could be some event, object, thing, or a person. And when we are saying positive or negative evaluation, it means that we are evaluating an object, a person or a thing in a positive or negative manner. Earliest use of that term attitude actually came from theatre when it was described as a body posture. और उस जमाने में ये मुराद ली जाती थी जब ये थिएटर में ये वर्ड यूज होता था कि यू कुड एक्सप्रेस योर एटीट्यूड बाय योर बॉडी पोस्चर. फॉर एग्जांपल, if a person is performing some role in theater and that person is showing that he is depressed, तो वो इस तरह से बैठा होगा कि with उसके shoulders जो हैं वो झुके हुए हैं, and that person may be sitting like that, और वो सोचों में गुम है, that person doesn't have a smile on his face. So posture, body posture would tell about the attitude of a person. So it dates back to 1880s when attitude was used in theatre as the posture of body. उसके बाद जो latest इसका use है, that is not the posture of body, actually that is the posture of mind. तो हम ये कह सकते हैं it is actually the state of mind. It is actually a very important concept of social psychology because psychology, अगर आप ये देखें तो that is the study of behavior and attitude is the determinant of behavior in most of the cases. Alport said in 1935 in his Handbook of Social Psychology, and that is mentioned on page 806, that attitude determines for each individual what he will see and hear, what he will think and what he will do. And he borrowed a phrase from William James when he said that they engender meaning upon the world. अब इससे मुराद क्या है? When William James said that attitudes engender meaning upon the world, इससे मुराद ये है कि when you are giving meaning to the world and when you are explaining your world, then your attitude play a dominant role in your perceptions of your world. Before 1990, people were talking about tri-component of attitude, and these three components were affective component, behavioral component and cognitive component, and that was called ABC, information about attitude. अब A से मुराद क्या है? As I said before, affective component. Affective component mean the person's emotions and affect toward the object is referring to that particular part of attitude. And when we say affective component, then we are talking about the emotional aspect of attitude. And the second, that is B part of ABC component of attitude, was behavioral component. That how the person tends to act toward the object is also an integral part of attitude. Although we have a consensus that attitude determine behavior, but it is not always that attitude is the only part that is affecting and that is showing the impact on behavior, because behavior could be influenced by past behavior also, and behavior could also be influenced by a person's situational factors. So it is not essential that attitudes are the only dimension that is determining a person's behavior. The third part in the tri-component of attitudes is the cognitive component, and that is the C part. Cognitive component actually refers to thoughts and beliefs the person has about the object. And this is the most complex part of attitude. So as I said before 1990s, people believed that attitude has these three components. And what are these three components? Affective, behavioral and cognitive. Lekin recently people have started talking about the single evaluative component of attitudes, because they criticize that it is not always essential that a person who is having a evaluative concept about a particular object, that a person is either liking or disliking a particular thing, he would have definitely a behavioral component also. मिसाल के तौर पर अगर हम repeatedly TV पर किसी कॉफी के ब्रांड का इश्तिहार देखते हैं, तो it is possible that we would have a positive attitude toward that particular brand of coffee. लेकिन हमने कोई behave उसकी तरफ नहीं किया होता. So it is not essential that always it is concerned with affective and behavioral and cognitive aspects also. Usually evaluative aspect is dominant when we are talking about attitudes. So when we are talking about single evaluative dimension of attitudes, then we can use different evaluative terms. कुछ terms जो हैं वो simple हैं, जैसे कि hate, love, like, dislike and so on. And some are specific terms that are that could be used in evaluation of objects. For example, when we are evaluating self, then we could use a specified term of self-esteem. When we are evaluating our relationship and attitude toward groups and peoples, we can talk about prejudice and discrimination. And similarly, interpersonal attraction is also one particular specified term that could be used in evaluating your relationships. एक डायग्राम आपको दिखाती हूँ जिसमें ये तीनों कॉम्पोनेंट जो हैं दे आर शोन टू बी अफेक्टिंग योर एटीट्यूड्स, behavioral, affective and cognitive aspect. लेकिन as I said before that most of the time we are just using evaluative likes and dislike concept of attitudes. So that is the section when we talked about components of attitudes. Now we will be talking the second dimension of today's lecture and that is assessment of attitudes. हम कैसे attitudes को assess करते हैं? There are basically two methods of assessing attitudes. One is direct method and the other is indirect method. Direct method is usually used when we are measuring attitude of people on simple, uncomplicated stuff. For example, you want to know that in the next election, कौन सा उम्मीदवार जो है वो कामयाब होगा. तो whatever are the potential voters, हम उनसे राय ले लेते हैं कि what is the likely outcome of that election. और उसमें usually जो है वो कोई complications नहीं होती हैं. And similarly, we conduct surveys on attitude of people about particular social issues. Sometimes there is a problem under investigation which is complex and to which people do not want to openly describe their opinion and attitude. For example, अगर आप किसी particular ethnic group या minority group के members से उनकी votes के बारे में पूछते हैं कि what could be the outcome of result और वो किस candidate को vote देगा, तो maybe sometime people get hesitant कि वो आपको सही ना बताएं, maybe due to group pressures and there could be other reasons also. Similarly, when you are measuring sensitive issues and you want to measure people's attitude about sensitive topics, तो फिर ये हो सकता है कि people are hesitant to describe their honest opinion और वो सही आपको ना बताएं. In that case, direct method is not appropriate. But usually for simple issues, हम direct method use करते हैं. Direct method में कई तरह की assessments के तरीके हैं. यहाँ पर मैं 3 methods को discuss करना चाहूँगी which are most commonly used. One is Likert method, the other is semantic differential scales and the third is latitude of acceptance. सबसे ज़्यादा इसमें पहला वाला method use होता है and that is Likert scales. That was introduced by Likert in 1932 and they are also called summated ratings. Summated ratings को क्यों कहते हैं? इसलिए कि हम अक्सर ये करते हैं कि the same scale is used for multiple questions in a questionnaire and then we sum up the score of all these questions. इसीलिए इनको summated scales भी कहा जाता है. इसकी एक मिसाल आपको यहाँ दिखा रही हूँ. For example, अगर आप ये जानना चाह रहे हैं कि students जो हैं उनकी opinion क्या है और या लोगों की opinion क्या है about co-education at college level. जैसे पाकिस्तान में college level पर ज़्यादातर co-education नहीं है. You want to know the attitude of people about co-education at college level. तो आप इस तरह की scale जो है वो भी दे सकते हैं जो कि positive और negative dimensions भी दिखा रही है और on negative you could write very much opposed and on positive side you could write down very much in favor. And if a person endorses extreme scores, so it would indicate that that person is having attitude in the exaggerated direction या extreme direction and that will also show the strength of attitude of a person. Sometimes it is not essential that you are using minus and plus both. You could use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and in that case usually 3 is the neutral point. As you can see here, 0 is the neutral point. Neutral point से मुराद ये है कि the person is neither opposing nor in favor of that particular issue which you are asking. अब दूसरी scale देखें, semantic differential scales. That was introduced by Osgood et al. In 1957. And it has actually 2 opposing words. That is why it is called differential scale. You have to differentiate between 2 opposite evaluative terms. और यूजुअली जो है वो जब आप किसी वर्ड का जिक्र करते हैं, अ वर्ड कुड हैव टू मीनिंग्स. वन इज डिक्शनरी मीनिंग और सिमेंटिक मीनिंग, एंड द अदर वन इज कॉनोटेटिव मीनिंग. और कॉनोटेटिव मीनिंग में देयर कुड बी थ्री एस्पेक्ट्स ऑफ कॉनोटेटिव मीनिंग. वन इज इवैल्यूएटिव एस्पेक्ट, other is potency effect, and the other third one is activity aspect. When we are saying evaluative aspect, it means you are measuring likes and dislikes of the person toward a issue. When you are talking about potency, it means you are measuring the strength of that attitude. And when the third part is referring to the activity level, mean how active your attitude is toward that particular object. लेकिन इन तीनों में यूजुअली जो है इवैल्यूएटिव टर्म्स आर मोर फ्रीक्वेंटली यूज्ड. फॉर एग्जांपल, प्लेजेंट, अनप्लेजेंट, डिजायरेबल, अनडिजायरेबल, गुड, बैड, और यूजुअली दे आर टू अपोजिंग connotations. And the third one is latitude of acceptance that was introduced by Sheriff and Hovland in 1961, and it has a number of scales given. जैसे कि आपको इस मिसाल में नजर आ रहा है. On the positive side, extreme size is very positive, number 4, and -4 says it is very negative. और कोई भी सवाल आप पूछ सकते हैं इस latitude of acceptance scale पर. अब latitude of acceptance scale is different from Likert scale in that sense that you are given a number of choices, और आपने उसमें से जितने लेवल्स आपको एक्सेप्टेबल हैं आपने उनको एनसर्कल करना है. सो यू आर एक्चुअली गिविंग द range of your acceptance of responses. For example, if a person circles all of the values which are before -2, तो इसका मतलब उसको ये सारे जो हैं वो acceptable हैं, और जिनको वो encircle नहीं करता, which shows that these are unacceptable to that particular person. अब बाकी मामले में आप कह सकते हैं it is similar to Likert scale, but as contrast to Likert scale, this is showing flexibility and rigidity of response. For example, a person who is having a lot of categories in circle, इसका मतलब ये है कि उसका acceptance level जो है that has a broad range. तो इसलिए ये इसको हम differentiate कर सकते हैं बाकी scale से. There are different problems in direct assessment, as I mentioned before. For example, people could have a desirability issue, and that is called social desirability factor, that in direct assessment people sometimes do not want to tell their opinion and attitude about a particular issue. That is why they would not be accurate in their descriptions, और इससे हमें जो picture मिलेगी वो that could not be reflecting their true attitude. इसकी एक मिसाल लेते हैं. Studies were conducted in different years about different dimensions. For example, one study was conducted in 1930s, and then the same kind of study was conducted in 1969, and that was actually measuring white people's stereotypes about black people. So these two studies showed that people belonging to white race, they were having more stereotypes in 1930s. And when they were measured again in 1969 by direct method, that they were having reduction in stereotypes. But the question was whether there was a real reduction in their stereotypes, or this was just an artifact of using direct method of measurement. एक और study का हवाला यहाँ पे दूंगी. That study showed less negative beliefs about black people, but much of stereotypes remained. And that study was done by Sigal and Page in 1971. So what it showed that people who belong to white race, they were having overall less negative beliefs about black people, but their most of the stereotypes were still there. इसका मतलब ये है कि direct methods not always would give you a true picture of the people's attitudes. So that is why when we have problem in direct assessment, then people use indirect methods of measurement of attitude. And that indirect method of measurement is called bogus pipeline technique. What is that bogus pipeline technique? It actually is used to convince the respondents that the experimenter has a pipeline into the respondent's real attitude. इसका मतलब ये है कि आपकी access है about the real attitude of the respondent, तो इसलिए अगर वो झूठ बोलना चाहे तो आपको पता चल जाएगा. अब इसका यकीन कैसे दिलाया जाता है रेस्पोंडेंट को कि हमें उसके ट्रू एटीट्यूड तक एक्सेस हासिल है? इसका तरीका ये किया जाता है, मिसाल के तौर पर एक एग्जाम्पल से इसको समझते हैं कि रेस्पोंडेंट्स को ये कहा जाता है कि आपने डिलिबरेटली झूठ और सच बोलना है ऑन सर्टन क्वेश्चंस. फॉर एग्जांपल, इफ देयर आर 6 क्वेश्चंस, तो ऑड नंबर्स पर आप सच बोलेंगे और इवन नंबर्स पर आप झूठ बोलेंगे. और उसके बाद एक रेडीमेड पहले से एक आपने ग्राफ बनाया होता है और वो उनको दिखाया जाता है अबाउट देयर इमोशनल रिस्पॉन्सेज. और ये कहा जाता है कि ये देखें, ये जो है वो आपने यहाँ पर झूठ बोला था, इसलिए ग्राफ जो है वो फर्क हो गया है ऑन द इफ यू कंपेयर इट विद द इवन नंबर्स. तो इवन और ऑड नंबर्स का जो ग्राफ है इट इज टोटली अपोजिंग. तो इसका मतलब ये है कि आपका झूठ जो है वो असेस हो गया. अब झूठ असेस कैसे किया जाता है कि एक ऐसे ही मशीन जो है वो साथ लगा दी जाती है और which is like the lie detector, and the person thinks that because it is a machine which could detect lies and which could have an access to your feelings, so if I tell lie it would of no benefit and the person who is investigator will know about that. So that is called bogus pipeline technique. और usually ये उसको यकीन दिलाने के लिए इस्तेमाल की जाती है रेस्पोंडेंट को कि the investigator has an access to the real attitude, जबकि असल में ऐसी कोई मेजरमेंट नहीं की जाती. और सवाल ये पैदा होता है कि आपको कैसे उस मशीन के साथ क्या ताल्लुक है उसका. तो लाई डिटेक्टर में हम बहुत सारी मशीनें यूज करते हैं विच कुड मेजर आवर ब्लड प्रेशर, आवर मसल टोन, और उससे हमें पता चल जाता है द पर्सन इज हैविंग इज एक्सप्रेसिंग ट्रूथ आर लाई. और उसकी वजह ये है कि व्हेन वी आर टेलिंग लाइज देन देयर आर सर्टेन चेंजेस दैट अकर इन आवर बॉडी सिस्टम. So the advantage of bogus pipeline technique is that they could be effective in getting people admit that they are indulged in bad habits. For example, they smoke too much or they drink too much, and they could be engaged in other unhealthy behaviors. And at the same time, we could be knowing about that kind of attitude, which could be about sensitive issues effectively. एक और method का मैं आखिर में जिक्र करना चाहूंगी, and that is actually direct method of measurement. And recent advances in electrophysiology have shown that they may remove the bogus from the bogus pipeline and make it possible to detect attitudes directly. Different studies have shown that people's facial muscles are working differently if they are having desirable or undesirable feelings towards some particular issue, object or person. तो डायरेक्ट मेथड में ये किया जाता है कि आपके साथ इलेक्ट्रोमायोग्राफ जो है वो अटैच कर दिया जाता है. इलेक्ट्रोमायोग्राफ इज एक्चुअली मेजरिंग मसल टोन, और आपकी मसल्स में जो चेंज आती है, इफ अ पर्सन मसल हैज बिकम टेंस, एक्चुअली दैट इज गिविंग एक्सेस टू अ पर्सन्स फीलिंग्स एंड एटीट्यूड्स. तो इस तरीके से हम ये मॉडर्न टेक्निक बाय यूजिंग इलेक्ट्रोमायोग्राफ वी हैव कम टू नो that it can be very successfully used to assess people's attitude about sensitive issues. क्योंकि जिस तरह से हमारे मसल्स में चेंज होगी उसी तरह से हमें ये पता चलेगा कि if there is a muscle change that will tell about what is happening deep inside that person's feelings. So these were a few techniques that are used for direct and indirect measurement of attitudes. Now I would like to wind up today's lecture. What we studied today, in the beginning we talked about what is an attitude, then we talked about different components of attitude, and we came to the conclusion that usually the evaluative concept and term of attitudes is given more importance, and that is likes or dislikes about a particular object, event or person. And then we talked about direct and indirect measurement of attitude. The next lecture will be about how attitudes are formed and maintained. Until then, Allah Hafiz.